Suffolk, November 1821. The Thornfield auction had been arranged by Lady Jessamine Holt, which meant it had been arranged with the dual precision of a woman who understood that books were the occasion, and the Duke of Ellesmere was the purpose. Soren Ashgrove had not appeared in society for 19 months. He had buried his first wife in the spring of the previous year, dismissed half his household by autumn, and withdrawn into Ellesmere Hall with the deliberate quietness of a man who had concluded that the world outside his gates required something from him that he was no longer willing to provide. Lady Jessamine had prepared 4 introductions, 4 women of appropriate fortune, agreeable temperament, and the kind of careful patience that a grieving duke was presumed to need. She had not, it must be said, consulted the duke about whether he wished to meet anyone at all. Elowen Drace arrived at Thornfield House on the arm of her father, Calder Drace, whose fortune had been built across 30 years in the paper and binding trade, supplying half the publishing houses in London with the raw material of literature, while never once presuming to call himself literary. He was a man who understood the distance between making the page and filling it, and he had raised his daughter in that understanding, which was to say, he had raised her surrounded by books she was encouraged to read, and a business she was expected to learn, and she had done both with a thoroughness that had long since ceased to surprise him. She wore a dress the color of dark walnut, well-made, unapologetic, the kind of fabric that announced sufficiency without requesting approval. She had her father's pragmatism in her posture and her mother's eye for detail in the way she entered the Thornfield library and assessed it within 15 seconds. The shelving, the light, the organizational logic, the condition of the spines, with the automatic attention of a woman who had grown up understanding that a room full of books was a room full of information about the person who had collected them. She was not here for the Duke of Ellesmere. She was aware, as everyone in the county was aware, that this auction had an ulterior architecture, that Lady Jessamine's guest list had been constructed with the careful geometry of a woman engineering proximity. But Elowen had come for Lot 31, a first edition folio of Hartwell's Botanical Surveyor with hand-colored plates that she had been tracking through private sale listings for 2 years, and she intended to leave with it, and everything else occurring in this room was, to her, secondary weather. She found the folio on the display table by the east window, lifted it with the practiced hands of someone who had been taught at 14 how to handle a binding without cracking the spine, and opened it to the frontispiece. The bookplate was lifting. A corner had separated from the end paper, curling upward in the draft from the window, and the adhesive had dried to a brittle amber along the edge. She reached into her reticule, produced a small bone folder and a tin of wheat paste no larger than a coin, and began, without ceremony or permission, to repair it. The Duke of Ellesmere had refused the first introduction at 10:30, the second at 11, the third at 15:15, and the fourth at 11:30, each refusal delivered with a courtesy so practiced and so final that Lady Jessamine, who had survived 40 years of managing reluctant men, recognized by the fourth that she had miscalculated not the women, but the strategy. He did not want to be presented with options. He did not, she was beginning to understand, want to be presented with anything at all. He had moved through the auction with the contained energy of a man enduring an obligation, speaking when addressed, examining the lots with an attention that was genuine but guarded, and positioning himself consistently at the edges of the room where the social currents were weakest. He was turning from a brief exchange with the auctioneer's assistant when he saw her. She was standing at the east window with a folio open on the display table before her, and she was doing something to it, with a small, flat instrument and the focused stillness of a person who had forgotten there were other people in the room. The November light came through the glass behind her and lit the page she was working on, and her hands moved with the unhurried confidence of someone performing a task she had performed many times. and he stood where he was for a full 10 seconds before he understood what he was looking at. She was repairing a bookplate. She was repairing a bookplate at a public auction with her own tools and her own materials, and the composed indifference of a woman who had identified a problem and was not interested in waiting for someone else to address it. He crossed the room. He did not realize he had decided to until he was halfway there, which was, he would later acknowledge, the first honest thing he had done in 19 months. She did not look up until his shadow interrupted her light. When she did, her expression was not the one he had received 4 times that morning, not the arranged warmth, not the calibrated interest, not the performance of a woman who had been briefed on what a duke required. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has interrupted their work, with a patience that was willing to be earned, but was not being offered freely. "That bookplate is older than the binding," he said. "It is," she said. 1746. The binding was redone in 1790. Whoever rebound it kept the original plate, but used an adhesive that was never going to hold past 30 years. It has held for 31, which I suppose is something. He studied her hands, the bone folder, the tin of paste. "You carry repair tools to an auction." "I carry them everywhere there are books," she said. "Books are mistreated more often than they are read. I find it difficult to watch." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that moved beneath the surface of the courtesy, the way a current moves beneath still water. "You are Calderdrace's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "I am." He regarded the book plate she had just pressed flat, the name inscribed on it in faded copper plate, and then her and his expression completed its shift into something she recognized, not from experience with him, but from experience with people who had arrived at a conclusion they were not willing to revisit. "I have found," he said, with the careful phrasing of a man selecting each word for its weight, "that people who handle beautiful things with great tenderness are either devoted to them or practiced at appearing so." He paused. "I have lost my confidence in distinguishing between the two." She held his gaze. She heard what he had said, and she heard what he had not said, and between the two she understood, with the clarity she brought to foxed pages and failing adhesives, that the sentence had nothing to do with bookplates and everything to do with a woman who was buried in a Suffolk churchyard, and a man who was still standing at her graveside in every room he entered. Elowen looked at him across the folio. She looked at the repaired bookplate, pressed flat and holding, and at the man who had crossed a room to speak to her and had arrived carrying a verdict he had written before he left the house that morning. She understood the verdict. She understood, more importantly, the wound beneath it, the thing about a buried wife and a judgment he no longer trusted, and she recognized, with the same instinct that told her when a binding was too far gone to save, and when it simply needed patience, that arguing with him would require him to defend a conclusion he had reached through grief rather than reason. And grief did not answer to argument. She picked up the bone folder. She slid it into her reticule with the unhurried precision of a woman completing a task. She closed the folio, slowly, with both hands, the way one closes a book that deserves the courtesy of care, and rested her palm flat on the cover for a single breath. It was a gesture that said everything the moment required. "This book is whole. I made it so. Your opinion of my reasons does not alter the repair." She looked up at him. "The bookplate will hold now, Your Grace," she said. "I have used a better adhesive than the last." She held his gaze for one unhurried moment. "I find that the materials matter more than the assumption." She inclined her head. Not a curtsy, not a bow, something that occupied the precise space between acknowledgement and departure, and returned to her father by the auction rail with the composed stride of a woman who had said what she intended and had left the rest of it on the table beside a folio that was, she noted, still warm from her hands. Her father, who had watched the exchange from across the room with the practiced stillness of a man who had spent 30 years reading the distance between what people said and what they meant, handed her the auction catalog without comment. She opened it to lot 31 and studied the estimate with the focused attention of a woman returning to business. "Well," he said after a moment. "He has good hands for books," she said. He looked at the folio before he looked at me, which is the correct order. Her father waited. "He is also," she said, turning the page, "the saddest man in this room, and he has made the sadness into a philosophy, and he is mistaking the philosophy for intelligence." She paused. "Lot 31 will go above estimate. I intend to bid to 40. Her father studied the catalog. He studied his daughter. He said nothing further, which was, between the two of them, a complete conversation. She won lot 31 at 37 guineas, which was a fair price, and she won 4 additional lots she had not originally intended to pursue, which was a decision she made in the 90 minutes following her conversation with the Duke, and did not examine too closely. She left Thornfield House with 5 folios, a folio stand she had not planned on, and the contained energy of a woman who had been assessed and found provisional and was not finished with the assessment. The letter arrived 3 weeks later from her father's solicitor in London. Briarton Manor, 11 miles southeast of Thornfield, and near the boundary of the Ellesmere estate, had come to market. The property was modest by Suffolk standards, a Jacobean house, 200 acres of mixed farmland, a walled garden in decline, but it contained, the solicitor noted in a line that occupied the bottom of the second page, a private library of approximately 3,000 volumes accumulated by 3 generations of the Waverley family, the majority uncatalogued, and a significant number in need of restoration. Allewen read the solicitor's letter twice. She read the line about the library 4 times. She purchased Briarton Manor in the first week of December. The paperwork moved with the efficiency of a woman who had her father's solicitors, her father's accounts, and the focused resolve of a person who had identified an opportunity and was not interested in hesitation. Her father, reviewing the deed of sale across the breakfast table in Manchester, set down his tea. 4 miles from Ellesmere, he said. "It is a sound collection at a reasonable price," she said. "The Waverley Library has not been properly catalogued since 1795. The restoration work alone will take a year." Her father regarded her with the expression she had known her entire life, the one that meant he saw precisely what she was doing and was choosing to let it unfold. "A year," he said. "At least," she said, and turned the page. She arrived at Briarton Manor on the 2nd Monday of December with 2 carriages of household goods, a housekeeper named Mrs. Calloway, whom she had brought from the Drace House in Manchester, and a bookbinder from London named Fessenden, whose specialty was 18th century adhesives, and who had agreed to a 6-month contract on the condition that the library had adequate light and a reliable source of clean water, both of which Allewen had confirmed by letter before she confirmed the purchase, because she understood priorities and arranged them accordingly. The county noticed. Suffolk in December was a county that paid attention, being rural enough that new arrivals were an event, and social enough that the nature of the arrival was scrutinized with the careful interest of people who had perfected observation as a form of entertainment. A young woman of fortune, unmarried, taking possession of a manor house near the most eligible and most reclusive duke in the county, in December, which was not the season for settling into Suffolk estates. December was for London, for the remaining social engagements, for the careful maintenance of connections that kept a family's standing intact. December in the country was for people whose positions required no maintenance at all. Allewen spent the first week learning the house. She walked every room, opened every window, tested every floorboard, and arrived at the library on the 2nd morning with the reverent caution of a woman entering a room she already knew she would not leave willingly. The Waverley Library occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor. 3 connected rooms, floor to ceiling, darkened oak shelving, aged by a century of use, and approximately volumes in every state of neglect and preservation. She stood in the center of the main room and breathed in the particular scent of old paper, leather, and dust that she had loved since she was 9 years old and had wandered into her father's warehouse and understood for the first time that books were objects before they were ideas, and that the objects required care. She began the catalog on Wednesday. By Friday, she had inventoried 400 volumes, identified 11 that required immediate conservation, and discovered something that changed the texture of her residency at Briarton entirely. 14 of the Waverley volumes contained Ellesmere bookplates. They were old plates, copper plate engravings, the Ashgrove crest with the motto Probitas ante honorum in a ribbon beneath, dated variously between 1740 and 1782. 14 books that had once belonged to the Ellesmere Library, acquired by the Waverleys through purchase or gift, or the informal lending arrangements that county families maintained across generations and occasionally forgot to reverse. She laid them out on the library table and examined them with the attention of a woman who understood provenance and the complications it created, and thought about a man nearby whose family's bookplates were sitting in her newly purchased library, which meant that a portion of her collection was, by historical if not legal right, a portion of his. She composed a letter that evening. The first attempt was too formal. She rewrote it, factual, specific, concluding with an invitation to examine the volumes at his convenience, which was the reasonable step, and also the step that would bring him into her library, which she was not going to examine too closely. His reply arrived the following morning, which was considerably faster than she had expected. It was written in his own hand, not a secretary's, and the handwriting was precise without being decorative, the penmanship of a man who valued clarity over flourish. Miss Drace, I am aware of the Waverley acquisition of several Ellesmere volumes. The matter was noted by my grandfather's steward and never pursued. I would be glad to examine them. Thursday, 10 o'clock, if convenient. Ellesmere. She read the letter twice. She noted that he had written it himself. She noted the absence of social courtesy, no pleasantries, no mention of her recent arrival, no welcome to the county. Just the time, the subject, and the expectation of her presence. She found this, despite every sensible instinct, considerably more interesting than politeness would have been. She sent back, Thursday, 10 o'clock. I will have the volumes prepared. E. Drace. Thursday was sharp and cold in the way Suffolk managed in December, the air carrying the particular stillness that came before frost, when everything was precise and nothing was hidden. She laid the 14 volumes on the library table in chronological order, by bookplate date, earliest to latest, and placed her own catalog notes beside each one, and waited. He arrived at 3 minutes to 10. He was on foot, which surprised her. The distance was not short for a December morning, and he was wearing a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, which was a detail she observed and chose not to account for. He brought no steward, no solicitor, no intermediary. He came alone, and she was not yet certain what category of visit that indicated. Mrs. Calloway showed him to the library. He entered and stopped 2 paces inside the door, and she watched him do what she had done on her second morning, stand still and take in the room. The full collection around him, the darkened oak, the December light through the tall windows. She watched his expression and saw something she had not expected, something that moved through his face too quickly for management. He loved books, not as a collector, not as a man who appreciated the appearance of a library, but as a reader, as someone for whom a room like this was not a display, but an environment, and he had just walked into one he had not been prepared for. The Waverley collection, he said, and his voice was different in this room than it had been at the auction, less guarded, less constructed. I had not realized it was this extensive. 3,000 volumes approximately, she said. I have cataloged 414. The condition varies. Some are exceptional. Some will require significant work. She paused. 14 are yours. She gestured to the table. He crossed to it and examined the volumes with the hands of a man who knew how to handle a book, supporting the spine, opening to the bookplate without forcing the binding, reading the inscription with the careful attention of someone encountering a family member's handwriting after a long absence. He picked up the 4th volume, A Natural History of Suffolk, dated 1761, and opened it to the Ellesmere plate. He ran his thumb along the edge of the plate, where it met the end paper, and she saw him register that it was holding firm. "This adhesive is new," he said. She met his eyes across the table. The plate was separating. I repaired it when I cataloged the volume, the same compound I used at Thornfield. He studied her. He studied the 13 other volumes on the table, each with an Ellesmere plate she had examined and, where necessary, restored before he arrived, without being asked, without announcement, with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who saw damage and fixed it, because that was what she did. Something shifted in his expression, not the guarded assessment from the auction. Something less managed than that. Something that did not have a policy attached to it. "You repaired them," he said. "They required it," she said. The December light fell across the table between them, across the 14 volumes and their Ellesmere book plates and the catalog notes in her handwriting, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was, she thought, its own kind of information. "The provenance question," he said. "These volumes, they are legally yours by purchase. The Waverley estate sale transferred clear title." "They are," she said. "And the book plates?" "Are historical artifacts within the volumes. They belong to the books." He considered this. "That is a generous interpretation." "It is an accurate one," she said. "The plates are part of the binding. Removing them would damage the end papers." "I do not damage books, Your Grace. It is a principle I have held since I was old enough to hold a principle." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the architecture of a smile that had been decommissioned for the better part of 2 years and was receiving its first structural inspection. "You are very certain of your principles," he said. "I find uncertainty is expensive," she said. "I prefer to invest in positions I can defend." He held her gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then he set down the natural history and said, "I would like to see the rest of the collection, if you are willing." A man who had refused 4 introductions had just asked to see 3,000 books. She considered what that revealed about priorities, and what they revealed. "I am willing," she said, "though I should warn you, I have cataloged 414. The remaining 2,600 are in considerable disarray." "I have some experience with disarray," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth committed slightly further, and she noted it, and set the observation aside, with the focused discipline of a woman who was not going to be impractical about a mouth. They spent 2 hours in the Waverley Library. She showed him the collection room, by room, and he asked questions that confirmed he had read widely and remembered precisely. And she answered with the authority of a woman who knew her subject. And somewhere in the 2nd hour, the conversation shifted from the books themselves to the practice of keeping them, storage, climate, binding materials, the economics of preservation. And she discovered that he had opinions on adhesive compounds that were not uninformed. And he discovered that she had read Hartwell's Botanical Surveyor 3 times and had identified 2 errors in the plate coloring that no one else had published, and neither of them noticed when the 2 hours became 2.5. and Mrs. Calloway brought tea without being asked, which was the trained judgment of a housekeeper who understood when a conversation was not to be interrupted, but the participants needed sustenance. He left at 12:30. At the door, he turned. "Thursday next," he said. "I will bring the Ellesmere catalog. There may be corresponding gaps." She stood in the doorway and watched him walk up the lane in the December cold, back to Ellesmere Hall, and thought about a man who had arrived guarded and had left having forgotten to be, and about the fact that he had suggested a second visit before she had needed to. She went back to the catalog. She did not think about the corner of his mouth for the rest of the afternoon, with moderate success. The Thursday visits became a fixed point. He arrived each week at 10, sometimes 3 minutes before, and they worked through the Waverley catalog with the systematic attention of two people who took books seriously and had discovered, with a surprise neither of them examined aloud, that they took them seriously in the same way. He brought the Ellesmere catalog on the second Thursday, a leather-bound ledger in his grandfather's handwriting, and they cross-referenced the entries together and found 11 additional volumes at Briarton that corresponded to gaps in the Ellesmere record, bringing the total to 25 books that had migrated between the two libraries across 70 years of county lending and casual neglect. "Your grandfather," she said on the third Thursday, running her finger down a column of entries in the Ellesmere ledger, "had a system. It is eccentric, but it is consistent. He catalogued by acquisition date rather than subject. He believed that the order in which a library was built told you something about the mind that built it," Soren said. He was sitting across the table from her in the Briarton library, and he said this with the unguarded ease of a man who had forgotten, for the duration of the sentence, that he was guarding anything at all. "He was right," she said. "A library organized by subject tells you what someone knows. A library organized by acquisition tells you what they needed and when they needed it." He held her gaze for a moment that extended one beat past the professional register. Then he returned to the ledger, and the moment closed, and she catalogued it alongside the growing collection of moments she was accumulating and not yet willing to interpret. January brought the Suffolk winter season, the county dinners, the evening gatherings, the rotating circuit of social occasions that carried the same families through the same rooms with the practiced rhythm of people who had been doing this for generations. Allawan had been received with cautious interest. She was wealthy enough to warrant attention. She was not titled enough to command deference. She was, several people had independently concluded, unusually well-read, which in Suffolk society was either a distinction or an inconvenience, depending on whose conversation she outperformed. She and the Duke attended the same dinner twice in January. The first was at the Caulfield estate, where Sir Emery Caulfield seated them at opposite ends of the table, with the transparent subtlety of a man who believed he was being discreet. They exchanged one remark across the room about a binding technique, which was overheard by Lady Caulfield, and became the most discussed exchange of the evening. The second dinner was at Jessamine House, which Lady Jessamine had arranged with the undisguised intention of a woman who had spent 2 months watching Thursday visits accumulate and had decided the process required social reinforcement. Allawan was seated close enough to the Duke to overhear his conversation with Sir Emery about the county lending library, and she noticed, with the awareness she had developed across the winter for the geography of his presence, that he was listening to Sir Emery with one quality of attention and to her conversation with Mrs. Caulfield about adhesive chemistry with another, and the second quality was the one that had nothing managed in it. At the close of the Jessamine dinner, Lady Jessamine appeared beside her in the entrance hall with the timing of a woman who had identified her moment with military accuracy. "You handled Sir Emery beautifully," Lady Jessamine said. "Sir Emery is knowledgeable about preservation," Allawan said. "Sir Emery is knowledgeable about preservation and almost nothing else," Lady Jessamine said. which makes him indispensable at dinner and entirely decorative at every other occasion. She glanced across the hall at her nephew, who was bidding the last guests farewell with the formal warmth of a host concluding an evening. He has not talked about books with anyone the way he talks about books with you. Not since, she paused, in some time. Elowen studied her gloves. I am aware of the history, she said. The history, Lady Jessamine said, is a grief he has been operating as a rule. Rules can be amended, she paused, with sufficient evidence. Lady Jessamine, Elowen said, with the composed directness she used as her standard register. I purchased Briarton Manor for the library. Of course you did, Lady Jessamine said, with the calm certainty of a woman who had heard the same sentence in 3 different phrasings across 2 months and had formed her own conclusion. Good evening, Miss Drace. February was wet. Suffolk in February produced a particular kind of persistent rain that found every weakness in a building's defenses, and Briarton Manor revealed 3 leaks in the east wing roof directly above the collection. Elowen discovered them on a Monday morning, water staining the ceiling plaster above the second room, a slow drip falling onto a shelf of 17th century quartos she considered among the finest in the collection. She dealt with it. She moved the vulnerable volumes, directed Mrs. Calloway and Fessenden in covering the shelves with oilcloth, and had a roofer engaged by Tuesday afternoon. She wrote to the Duke on Wednesday, not about the roof, but about a provenance question in the catalogue, a volume whose Ellesmere bookplate had been partially obscured by a later owner's inscription. He arrived on Thursday morning with his opinion and a name she had not heard before. Marin, he said, in the context of explaining why a particular volume had left the Ellesmere library. My wife, she gave several books away during... He stopped. The sentence ended in a space she recognized from the auction, the space where a name and a wound occupied the same silence. During the period before her death, he finished, she was not attentive to the catalogue. Elowen regarded the volume. She regarded the man across the table who had just said his dead wife's name in her library, without planning to, and was now managing the aftermath with the careful stillness of a person who had touched something hot and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. The inscription is a bookseller's mark, she said quietly. Hargrove and Sons, Bury St. Edmunds. She sold them, not gave them. She met his eyes. The distinction matters for the catalogue. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It does. He stayed an extra hour that Thursday. They did not discuss Marin again. They discussed the roof leaks, the quartos she had moved, and whether the east wing drainage was adequate. And he asked questions that confirmed he understood the problem, and one that suggested he had dealt with something similar at Ellesmere, and the afternoon was entirely practical and entirely not. The spring assembly at the Caulfield estate was the first large gathering of the season. 45 people, the full county, the opening of a social calendar that would carry through to midsummer. Elowen arrived with Lady Jessamine, who had developed the habit of collecting her for these occasions without formal arrangement, which was Lady Jessamine's method of establishing facts without the inconvenience of negotiation. The Duke was there. He was across the room when she entered, and he looked up, and the attention was the one she had stopped pretending not to catalogue. The evening moved as these evenings did. She spoke with the Caulfields about the spring planting. She spoke with Sir Emery about a preservation technique she had read about in a German journal, and the Duke appeared at Sir Emery's elbow at some point during the discussion, and remained, and the 3 of them talked about paper chemistry until Sir Emery was summoned by his wife, and then it was the 2 of them, and the conversation shifted from chemistry to the Waverley catalogue, to a question he asked about her father's printing operation in Manchester, which was the first question he had asked about her life rather than her work. She answered it. He listened with full attention. He asked a second question. She thought, This is what it looks like when he is present without managing the presence, she thought. I should not be documenting what his attention looks like when it is not performing. Lord Aldrich Tyne arrived at her left shoulder. She had observed him circling for 20 minutes. Tyne was a baronet of 56 who had occupied his position in Suffolk society for 3 decades and considered the occupation itself a qualification. He had attached himself to the Ellesmere orbit with the gravitational persistence of a man who had confused proximity to a title with possession of one, and she had learned across the winter that wherever the Duke appeared in public, Tyne followed with the proprietary alertness of a dog guarding a gate he did not own. Miss Drace, Tyne said, with the tone of a man preparing to be witty for the benefit of the 4 people within comfortable hearing distance. He had chosen his moment. Briarton is looking well, I understand. Quite the restoration. Thank you, she said. The collection required attention. Restoration, he said, smiling at his audience. You are evidently skilled at it. One does wonder. The theatrical pause of a man who had been deploying these pauses his entire adult life. Whether the scope of the restoration extends beyond the bookshelves. He let the word restoration do its work. In a neutral mouth, it meant what it meant. In his mouth, with his pause and his audience and his careful smile, it meant, you are a tradesman's daughter, restoring yourself into a position above your station, and you are restoring a broken duke into something you can use, and everyone in this room understands the project. She held his gaze with the composure of a woman who had been navigating hostile rooms since she was old enough to attend her father's trade negotiations, and had encountered this variety of condescension in Manchester boardrooms and London drawing rooms, and had developed a thorough vocabulary for responding to it. She was assembling that response when the Duke spoke. The restoration at Briarton, the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the Thursday voice, not the dinner voice, not the careful library voice, but the one beneath all of them, the one that carried 2 centuries of Suffolk in it, and understood precisely what that weight could do in a room. Includes the conservation of 25 volumes bearing Ellesmere bookplates, several of which are among the finest 17th century quartos in the county. Miss Drace has preserved books that my own family failed to protect for 70 years. He turned to Tyne with the unhurried gaze she recognized from the auction, except this time it was directed at someone else entirely. The restoration is expert, thorough, and of considerable benefit to Ellesmere as well as Briarton, as anyone familiar with the collection would know. He held Tyne's gaze for 1 beat longer than was necessary, which was the ducal equivalent of a closed door. Then he returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred, and Tyne found other company with the careful haste of a man who had been corrected in public and required a period of recovery. Eloin stood beside the Duke in the silence that followed and thought about the weight of what he had said and the way he had said it, not as a rescue, but as a correction of record. He had made it about the books rather than about her, so that Tyne had no path to continue without challenging the Duke's expertise on his own family's collection. She crossed to Lady Jessamine, who studied her expression, and then the Duke across the room, and then her expression again. Well, Lady Jessamine said. He intervened, Eloin said. He did not have to. No, Lady Jessamine said, accepting a glass of wine with the composure of a woman who had been anticipating this conversation for 3 months. And Tyne will be cautious for the remainder of the season, which is useful for everyone. Eloin looked across the room at the Duke, who was in conversation and was not looking at her. He made it about the books, she said. He made it about the collection. He made it about the collection, Lady Jessamine agreed, so that Tyne had no dignified way to continue, so that the room understood his position without a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused. That is a very specific kind of care. Elawan held her glass and thought about Thursdays and bookplates and February rain, and a man who had told her he could not distinguish devotion from performance, and had just, in front of 45 people, demonstrated that he had learned the difference. He came to Briarton on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the assembly, which was fast enough to mean it had been decided before he left the Caulfield house. She was in the East Wing, supervising Fessenden's work on a damaged octavo, and was not in the condition she would have chosen for receiving a Duke, but she had stopped arranging herself for his convenience sometime in January, and was not resuming. She met him at the library door. "I owe you something," he said. She waited. "At Thornfield," he said, "in November. What I said about devotion and performance, the way I said it." He paused. He was looking at the library shelves rather than at her, which was the only sign that this was costing him anything. "I arrived at that auction with a position that had been fixed before I entered the room. A position that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with Marin," she said. He met her eyes. "I understood at the auction," she said. "That is why I closed the book. Not because you offended me, though the words were not kind. Because I understood that you were not seeing me. You were defending against a pattern you had already survived once, and were determined not to repeat." He was quiet for a long moment. "She performed everything," he said. "Marin. She performed interest and devotion, and the life we were supposed to have, and none of it was real, and I did not see it until it was too late to see it without consequences." He studied the catalog on the table. "I chose her, against advice. I trusted my own reading of her, and my reading was catastrophically wrong. What I lost was not only a wife, I lost my confidence that I could look at another person and understand what I was seeing." Elawan looked at the man standing in her library, who had just handed her the architecture of his wound, without deflection or self-justification, who had named what he had done, and named the reason, and stopped there. "I am not Marin," she said. "I am not a correction for Marin. I am not a cautious alternative to Marin. I am a woman who carries paste and a bone folder because she cannot bear to watch a bookplate separate from its page, and if you cannot see the difference between that and a performance, then you are not reading carefully enough." She met his eyes. "And you read carefully. I have watched you do it every Thursday for months. You are capable of this distinction. You were simply not ready to make it in November." The Tuesday morning light came through the windows and fell across the library table. "I was not ready," he said. "No." He paused. "I have been revising since approximately December." "I know," she said. "I have been watching the revision." He looked at her with the expression that had nothing managed in it, the one that had been emerging across months of Thursdays and dinners and February rain, and was now entirely present and entirely undefended. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did at the assembly. Tyne was—" "You defended me," she said. "Before Tyne finished his sentence, before I needed to respond." He met her eyes. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was wrong," he said. "And I was the person in that room most qualified to say so, and the most obligated." He paused. "And because you had already made the case more thoroughly than anything I could say in a drawing room, I wanted the room to have the record." She offered him tea. He accepted. She brought him to the library table rather than the drawing room, because the library was where she worked and where she was honest, and this was not a conversation for performing rooms. She poured. She handed him his cup. She sat in her chair across the catalog and the provenance notes and the Ellesmere ledger that had been sitting on her table since December, because he kept leaving it, and she kept not returning it, and neither of them had acknowledged this arrangement. "Soren," she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and his honorific, and the formal space where a name would go, and now the name itself was in the Briarton library between them. Yes, he said. I bought this estate because of you, she said. Not entirely. The collection is genuine. The investment was sound. All of that remains true. But I bought it knowing it was near Ellesmere, and I told myself it was about the library, and I believed it for approximately 3 weeks. She studied the provenance notes before her. I was not angry, exactly. I was unseen. You looked at me at that auction, and you saw a category, not a person. And I thought, if I were nearby, if I were unavoidable, if I were doing the work in front of you every week, you would eventually have to see what was actually there. She paused. It was not an entirely rational strategy. It was an effective one, he said. It resulted in a provenance dispute, and a roof leak, and a catalog that has consumed most of my Thursdays since December. It resulted, she said, in you sitting in this library having this conversation. Yes, he said. It did. He set his cup down. I consider the investment sound. He stood. He came around the table and stood before her chair, and she rose because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were very close in the Briarton library, with the spring light coming through the tall windows, and the catalog between them, and months of Thursdays behind them. I was wrong about you, he said, at Thornfield. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong in the meeting. And I am asking. He stopped. He looked at her with the expression that had nothing left in it, that was managed or defended or held in reserve. I'm asking whether I have read carefully enough this time. She considered the bone folder and the book plate, and the book she had closed with both hands on a November morning. She thought about what the closing had meant then, and what it would mean to open something now, in this room, with this man who had stood in front of 45 people and said, as anyone familiar with the collection would know, and who had walked to her library in December to sit with his grandfather's handwriting. She did not close anything. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, the way she placed her palm on the cover of a book she intended to keep. You have read carefully enough, she said. He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It carried the conviction of a man who had spent months revising a position and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to stand behind. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to damaged bindings and provenance records, and every true thing she had ever committed to. And the library was warm, and the spring morning was outside, and the Ellesmere ledger was still on the table where he kept leaving it, and she kept not returning it, and neither of them required any further catalog. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. The provenance question, she said. Is settled, he said. The Ellesmere ledger, she said. Is yours, he said. It has been yours since January. I have been leaving it here on purpose. She looked at him. I know, she said. I have been not returning it on purpose. He regarded her with the half-smile she had catalogued since December, and was now permitted to say she had catalogued, the architecture of a smile that had been restored to working order. You are going to be very difficult, he said. I am going to be precise, she said, which is different and more useful. They were engaged by the 3rd week of April. He had asked in the Briarton library, again on a Wednesday morning, with the directness she had come to depend on, and she had said yes with the same directness, and they had shaken hands, and then both looked at their joined hands with the recognition that a handshake was an unusual response to a proposal, and she had laughed, and the laugh was small and genuine and unperformed, and he received it with the expression she now understood was his version of complete happiness. Quiet, contained, and entirely real. Her father received the news in Manchester with the satisfaction of a man who had watched his daughter purchase a neighboring estate, and had understood precisely what she was doing, and had waited with considerable patience for the outcome. "The Duke of Ellesmere," he said, setting down the trade accounts he had been reviewing when she told him. "The man who could not distinguish devotion from performance. He has revised that assessment considerably," she said. "He sat in my library every Thursday and watched me repair his family's bookplates and asked questions about adhesive compounds, and I find it difficult to hold a man's November against him when his April is everything it should be." Her father regarded her with the attention of a man who had been studying this particular person since she was 9 years old and had never once been disappointed by what he observed. "Does he deserve you?" She thought about it with the honesty the question required. "He is becoming worthy of the question," she said, "which I believe is the most reliable version of the answer." Her father nodded. "It is the most reliable version," he agreed. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon, a letter that was brief and direct and contained the precise dimensions of the Drace fortune that would accompany the match, stated without apology or embellishment, the way her father stated everything. Elowen read it before it was sent and found it entirely correct and entirely her father. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Elowen, not to her father, which said everything about his priorities. It read, "Your father's letter was thorough and entirely beside the consideration. I am not acquiring a collection. I am being catalogued by one. The terms are accepted. The binding is permanent. S." She read this twice. She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 14, going back to the first note about the Ellesmere volumes, and she returned to the spring catalogue with the focused attention of a woman who was thoroughly pleased and intended to remain entirely practical about. Lady Jessamine called on Thursday. She arrived at Briarton at 11 with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 5 days, which represented the outer boundary of her capacity for restraint. "Well," she said, before fully sitting. "Well," Elowen agreed. "The library again." "The library," Elowen confirmed. "Both times." "He proposed in a library. He proposed in a library, and I accepted in a library, and I see no reason to apologize for the consistency." Lady Jessamine accepted tea and settled in. "He was happy when he called on me yesterday. I have not seen him happy in 2 years. He shows it the way he shows everything, very quietly and without announcement. But it was there." She looked at Elowen. "You are good for him." "He's good for me," Elowen said, "which is the thing I did not expect." "What did you expect?" Elowen turned toward the window, the spring garden, the lane leading north toward Ellesmere. "I expected to prove a point," she said. "I expected to be here and be competent and make it impossible for him to maintain the position he had taken. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the ones that made him worth the argument." "What was he right about?" "That a woman who handles books with genuine devotion is a particular kind of person," Elowen said. He had entirely the wrong conclusion about what that meant, but the observation was not wrong. Lady Jessamine smiled, not the society smile, but the real one. "He has acquired a wife who will reorganize his library before the honeymoon." "He has been warned," Elowen said. "He mentioned it twice during the proposal. He described it as an anticipated outcome." Lady Jessamine rose. "The engagement dinner. I will host it the first week of May. The Caulfields, Sir Emery, the full county." She paused at the door. "Tyne will be invited." Elowen looked at her. "Because," Lady Jessamine said, with the measured confidence of a woman playing a long strategy, "it is better to seat him at the table where he must perform civility, than to leave him outside it, where he will not. And because the sight of Lord Tyne congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Ellesmere will be among the most satisfying things I have witnessed in recent memory." She paused. "I am not too dignified to enjoy it." Elowen considered this. "I find I am not too dignified for that either," she said. The engagement dinner at Jessamine House was on the 7th of May. 44 people, the full county. Elowen wore walnut brown again, not the same dress, a better one, commissioned from London, cut by someone who understood that this color against her complexion was not a choice, but a fact. She wore her mother's cameo at her throat, simple and correct. Soren arrived at the table and looked at her. "The brown again," he said. "I find it works," she said. "It does," he said, and sat, and regarded her over his wine-glass with the full, unguarded attention. Tyne congratulated them at the end of the evening. He said the correct things, in the correct order, with the grace of a man managing the only option available to him. When he said them to Elowen, he met her eyes, and she met his with the composed directness that was her natural register, and nothing further was required. Soren beside her said nothing. His presence was the statement. They were married in June at the stone church that stood in the village between the Ellesmere and Briarton estates, which was geographically convenient and architecturally beautiful. A Norman nave, a good east window, floors that had been there since the 13th century. She wore a dress the color of ivory, not white, because white was a performance, and ivory was a material, and she understood the difference. Her father walked her in on his arm, and the village turned out, and Suffolk turned out. 44 people from the engagement dinner, and a significant number beyond, because the marriage of a duke was an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion that carried the additional quality of a story the county had been following since November, with the invested attention of people who had sensed something was going to happen and had not been entirely certain what. She walked toward Soren at the front of the church and thought about the auction at Thornfield and the man who had refused 4 introductions and crossed a room because he saw a woman repairing a bookplate by a window. She thought about all the versions of the book. The first closing, at the auction, both hands, palm resting on the cover. "I see what you are doing. I have finished my work. I am leaving this where it is." The second, the 14 Ellesmere volumes laid out on the Briarton table, opened for him, restored before he asked. "I see your history. I have cared for it without being asked." The third, the Ellesmere ledger left on her table, Thursday after Thursday, neither returned nor mentioned. "This is staying." We both know why. She had thought about the 4th version. She had thought about where it would happen and what it would mean, and she had decided in April that the 4th would not be a closing at all. She reached the front of the church. Soren looked at her with the full unmanaged attention, the expression that had nothing of November in it, nothing of the auction assessment, nothing of the man who had armored his grief into a philosophy, just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the estate nearby and catalogued his grandfather's library and fixed his family's book plates and been right about everything and had chosen him regardless. She took his hand. He held it with the firm, unhesitating grip of a man who meant what he agreed to. The wedding breakfast was at Ellesmere Hall because it was the larger house and because Suffolk expected it. Elowen moved through the occasion with the ease of a woman who understood rooms and had decided, sometime in March, that this particular room was one she intended to inhabit permanently. She spoke with the Caulfields and Sir Emery and Lady Jessamine, who wore the expression of a woman whose long strategy had exceeded even her own projections and was exercising heroic restraint about it. She spoke with her father, who found her at the edge of the afternoon, when the breakfast was drawing toward its close. He looked at her with the attention that had never missed anything important. "Well," he said. She looked at the room. She looked at Soren across it, managing the occasion with the quiet precision she had come to love, and doing it today with something she had not seen at any previous occasion, a lightness, small but unmistakable. "He is happy," she said. "Are you?" She considered the question honestly. "I am," she said. "I am also still intending to reorganize his library, revise the estate ledger, and revisit a remark he made in February about Manchester binding techniques that was technically accurate and entirely unnecessary." "You are going to be a magnificent duchess," her father said. "I know," she said. "I have been planning on it." Soren found her in the Ellesmere Library in the late afternoon. She was standing at the east wall, running her hand along the spines with the deliberate attention of a woman already taking inventory. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and she knew he was there, and she let him watch, because this was not a performance, and she was not going to treat it as one. "The organization," she said without turning, "has no discernible system." "It was my grandfather's system." "Your grandfather's system is a theory. I intend to give it a practice." She turned to face him. He crossed the room. The June light came through the tall windows, warm and unhurried, and the Ellesmere Library was quiet, and the books stood on their shelves in their imperfect order, and the Briarton chimneys were visible through the south window in the distance, 2 estates on either side of a boundary she had crossed in December and had no intention of crossing back. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small object. A bookplate, freshly engraved, the copper plate still sharp. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. Ellawen Ash Grove, Ellesmere Hall. Not Drace. Ash Grove. His name, in her handwriting, on a plate designed to be placed inside a book. The most permanent claim a person who loved books could make. "This is where I belong. I am placing myself here." He looked at her. She saw him understand it completely. The auction and the bone folder and the book she had closed with both hands, and every bookplate she had repaired, and every volume she had catalogued, and every Thursday she had opened her library to him, all of it leading to this. A woman placing her name in his house, not because a duke had questioned her devotion, but because she had always known what devotion looked like, and had spent 7 months making certain he understood it too. "Soren," she said. "Ellawen," he said, and her name in his voice carried all of November and December and every month since, and none of it was a wound anymore. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the bookplate was between them in his hand, and the June evening went on around them, warm and unperformed, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in November. The best collections, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had built them than before. She understood this one completely.